what an amazing evening. What a privilege to hear these things.
That is quite something to follow, your segment.
Yeah, we should have a 15-minute silence resonant with what you were saying, Ahmed. I was very interested, though, in the influences. I think Charlie Chaplin was mentioned. I think I'd prefer, for Irish prose, maybe the Marx Brothers, but for sheer syntax and writing, I thought Bruce Lee was a brilliant choice of influence.
Sebastian, we're going to talk about Days Without End primarily. And it is so interesting sitting listening to all these stories here and thinking of those tales of exile, of escape, of cultures crossing. And that really is what this book is about, isn't it?
Well, the curious thing about, many curious things, but enormous trauma brought to bear on a people, inverted commas, is that it has many stages of aftermath. I mean, the thing happening, obviously, is extraordinary, out of the ordinary. I'm thinking in this book of the famine in Ireland in the 1840s. It's traditionally considered to be our famine or belonging to the Irish people, but in another way it isn't, because as far as I can see, the people who suffered in the famine were virtually invisible in their own country. There were 8 million people in Ireland. During the famine years, 1 million died, both of hunger and fever, and 1 million left. But whose 2 million people were they? Were they their own people, their own sisters, their own mothers? And why did no one really care enough about them in a very vigorous and food-rich country? Why did they not care enough to feed them? Who was seeing them? And my horrible suspicion now, after just thinking about it in my lifetime, all my lifetime, is that we couldn't see them because they were, inverted commas, an underclass, people who had no land, generally speaking, people who had nothing, people who were dependent upon an extra quality in Irish life at the time, which was the fact that you could have a 1/4 acre on a mountain which you could plant with your potatoes and then go on the roads begging for the rest of the summer, no doubt hungrily, and then come back in the latter part of the summer and get your potatoes, which would carry you forward for a few months. But the fact of the matter is, in a time when photography, for instance, was all the rage in the country houses and elsewhere in Ireland, there isn't one photograph. There is not one photograph. There is not a shadow of a photograph. There is not a little segment, a little torn shred of a photograph of the famine in Ireland. No one took a photograph of anything that was going on. These were things happening not only in the countryside, but also in the cities, also in towns. In the countryside, people describe going into a cabin and seeing the father and mother maybe just barely alive, the children already dead, lying on the stone floor, very Dickensian in its way. But no one photographed it, because maybe no one saw it, nobody was really seeing it, because no one was feeling that these were their people. Because in the same period, you have, as I say, an enormous amount of food production, an enormous amount of sending of food to England, which was also struggling. You have a lot of activity, but you don't have any activity being turned towards these people. And Thomas McNulty in Days Without End is one such poor, unfortunate creature who has watched his family die on a stone floor in Sligo, and at the age of 13 is sneaking onto, of all things, a coffin ship, which is another dreadful way to flee your country. And all during the Syrian crisis, the ongoing Syrian crisis, there's for me, just as an ordinary human being, a kind of undertone, sort of Irish note being played under it. And how you, although in a way I hesitate to lay claim to anything, because here we are 150 years, whatever it is, after the famine, quite safe. But what we need in our time is seeing. We need to have in our heads, when we close our eyes, a way of seeing what is happening in our world, so that you have filled your brain with a resource of imagination, so that you just don't see blank and dark, that you are actually taking, with your open eyes, an endless series of photographs of things, so that it is remembered, so that it is understood. And how do we ever reach that level of understanding where the creature that we are is not even merely redeemed, but altered and changed, so that we don't let these things happen anymore?
Sebastian, can I ask you, in what sense then, just that's to follow on from that, you have written a novel that you could describe in many ways. It's a love story, it's a war story, it's a story of immigration, of emigration, of a plotting out of land. The story takes place in America. It's a Western in lots of ways. It would also fall into the category historical novel, but it strikes me that it's not really. And is there, in fact, any such thing? You're writing this novel from now. It's a curious enterprise, isn't it?
Well, novelists are just another robin in the contemporary garden, trying to make our bird song heard, first for ourselves and then for anyone who loves the song of the robin, of that particular robin. I read for a year for this book. I mean, I'm not the world's happiest reader. I couldn't read really till I was 8. It's still a terrifying prospect to read 300 books for a year, but I did read to try and get the history into me. But nothing I read, I mean, spookily so, almost nothing I was reading about America in the 1850s and 60s, Ireland, America in the 1840s, was past. In the 1850s, there was this know-nothing movement which was saying, there's enough people in America now, we're all full up. This was before people even went west, more or less. That's it, close the borders, don't let anyone else in. And then God help them, what happens is this 500,000 Irish people come flooding in, destroying the beautiful balance of Protestantism, a very admirable religion, but unfortunately these people were Catholic. And not only that, but if you consider most of the people are traveling in great distress for a number of weeks in dreadful boats, driven, some of them I do believe, to consuming each other in the holds, because the holds wouldn't be opened till you got to America 6 weeks later. So if the captain was even still alive, somebody would open the hold and the fetid air would spread out, and what was left of the people would disembark in Canada and maybe put into holding sheds, there to die possibly. But not only, and we tend to prioritize them, and that's quite right, the people who didn't make it, but thousands upon thousands made it, to the horror of the population. To the horror of the population. There was outcry against these lice-like people spreading out over the countryside, these deeply uneducated, hungry, starving, ragged, undesirable Catholic rabble, and indeed probably quite an angry group of people in essence, in certain parts of it. So, they were... And of course, we were in essence a sort of terror on the countryside, because a lot of people were carrying fevers and diseases, and there was a justice in their fear as well. But anyway, this gave rise to these remarks, and the lack of welcome. Irish America doesn't quite remember it like this, but the lack of welcome of Irish people reminds me, as I was writing the book, of all the things I was hearing And I wanted to, as a father, never mind a bloody writer, to ask someone to explain to me how, for instance, the government here was allowing even that tiny group of people, those few hundred children who had a right to be in Britain, was allowing them to remain in Calais, and then was allowing them to be dispersed when Calais was destroyed, and who are still out there in the countryside somewhere. How anyone could not in their brains see that those children, as you so rightly said, I mean, that boy in that camp is my son. That girl in that camp is my daughter. Our daughter, our children. And what is stopping you rising up, even as a bloody government, and sort of going and rowing to Calais in boats to get them? Theresa, why don't you row to fucking Calais rather than going over to see that vagabond and bring them back? Because it is us. It's not like we're the same people and we're like each other. Homo sapiens, modern humans, every corner of the earth come from the same incredible 3 or 5 women in Africa. There's no modern human that doesn't. As one of my characters in one of my books says, the good news is we're all the same family. And the bad news is we're all the same family. Because aren't we rotten bad to the family we have around us sometimes? And this is a familial question. We've been alive this long in the world. We've read the history of the world. We know what the history of the world is. We thought, I'm 61 years old. I have some vague inkling of what I am as a creature, where I am. We've seen our history. What do we do to show our bloody wings again? Why does, this is really answering your question. I promise you. But why do journalists, my most revered profession, my daughter's a journalist. Why as soon as there is an imposter put into a sacred office, the office of President of America, why do all the machine, I understand why, but I'm still asking why. Why does all the machinery of the beautiful BBC, of Channel 4, even regretful, you can see the regret in Jon Snow's face, but why do they turn their attention? It was like George Bush was bad enough, because the same thing happened. But how comes, again, we have to hear, and the choices and these ugly things he's signing, everything is a libel, he's doing is a libel on the human soul, even if we don't have one. Why is this allowed? I was writing a book about the birth pangs of a country with all the ambiguity of an abandoned Irish person who'd lost his, who had lost his past in Ireland, who had lost his future, had lost the people who were close to him, who had lost the people who loved him and who he had loved and who he would have loved in the future, the girl or the boy he would have fallen in love with eventually and married or knocked around Kerry with, lost all that, but then goes to America, and because it's kind of what you had to do, he gets into the army uniform of the US Cavalry, and then sets about engaging in battles and massacres of people not unlike himself. So that's what worries me ultimately.
Well, essentially, he's sort of conscripted, isn't he? And he is then forced, basically, to clear Indians out of California.
It's in America where if you worked or you died. There's no littles, there's no social services. If you didn't get work and work you could do, which is, and he can go soldiering, you die. And in fact, that was the other thing that was incredibly strange reading the history. There's so much famishing. We think we have the kind of copyright on hunger in Ireland. It's stupid us, because sometimes we forget to read the history of, even England or Scotland. And the famishing that's going on. There was reading about Andersonville, which was the Confederate, where Thomas is held in the Confederate prison in the South, for instance. Because there's no food in the South at that time during the Civil War. This is the Civil War now. he's turning into a skeleton, which is unfortunate because his other job is as a kind of a cross-dressing act in the music hall. And unfortunately now this awful experience is removing any trace of beautiful looks that he had. So he is famishing, but not only is he famishing, and John, his beloved, is famishing, and all the other Union soldiers, but the guards are famishing because there's no food in the South. And here's another ambiguity. The South, which we have learned in a way to decry, they were so amazingly brave. They were fighting on with nothing, without even shoes on their feet. But this is what I fear most about the world, is this Irish person who should have come, like this beautiful man, in some way into America and seen around him what there was to say, and to tell everyone about what had happened in Ireland and why you should approach us as yourselves, so that you cannot stand here and here. We are standing in the same position, same sacred position. We're a human being. But instead of doing that, he gets into his army garb and he engages initially in the destruction of Native America. I mean, Native Americans, if I may say, as an ignorant Irish person, if they weren't there for 14,000 years in America, they were there for 40,000 years. So I think they knew how to live in America, Mr. Jackson. That's Andrew Jackson. I think they knew what they were doing, and I think they knew, they were an amazing culture. And I think unless America predicates itself on the fact that it was built upon a total erasure, a total genocide, a total destruction, then you can't go on to talk about the glories and beauties of America. Not really. You're not really licensed to do that. And it hurts me to think of all the Irish people having had these incredible traumatic experiences in Ireland, then went on not to prevent those things, but to contribute to them. This is what I fear most about us as a creature, that our empathy isn't the only thing put into gear by trauma. Sometimes there's another thing which is a sort of violence, which is a sort of anger. And I think Europe should be very afraid of its neglect and its ignorance and the things it says instead of the things it should be saying vis-a-vis Syria or Libya or any of these places. Because what it will cause is a turmoil and a cauldron of anger that will be so justified that the halls of heaven, which don't exist of course, will be ringing with this justified anger.
Sebastian.
Yes, my darling.
I look at the egg timer,
Yes.
and I know that we have had
Is it gone again?
conversations. We've had conversations over kind of many years, as we were just saying.
Yes.
And I said to you before, of course, you are a very generous responder. You are a full answerer. And
you got 3 questions in, though. That was a record for us.
We had 15 minutes. It slightly reminds me of when, I think it was on this stage when I asked Edna O'Brien one question, and 2 hours later we were sort of dragged off. But you said that just to teach me a lesson, you might go monosyllabic and taciturn tonight. You have not, which is delightful. I want to end.
Well, I did speak one word at a time. So that's kind of...
That's not what it means. I want to end with one question, if
Yes.
I could, and it is a sort of large one.
Yes.
And it's about the fact that you have written works that all connect up in some or other way. They are a sort of family of novels.
Mm-hmm.
Characters recur. It is not linear. It doesn't go they're not a sequence, are they, in any way? That is something that I think lots of writers do, but you notice perhaps particularly in writers who are talking about diaspora and who are talking about exile. And I wonder if there is some kind of reparative instinct there. And that is the note on which I hope you might bring us to a place of sort of hope at the end of this evening.
Well, when I was providing a quote for Joseph O'Neill's book, Netherland, a very great book, which I love so much. I mean, you're so grateful when you get a book you love. Anyway, I said, it was as if there had been an explosion and everything utterly destroyed. But nevertheless, this man was trying to walk out into the fields to take everything back and put everything back in its place. And I think that's what anyone is trying to do in their art. Art isn't about being praised, obviously. It's not about being stylish, not about being better than everybody else. It's literally trying to do an impossible task, which is find the shards and precious shattered objects that explained you as a human being and kind of was your manumission and was your passport. And it's all in tatters and bits, but you go out anyway to try and retrieve it. You put it back in baskets so that you can come back to the center and reinstate it. And that's all I've been trying to do for 39 years. I see that now. I wouldn't have known that at the beginning. But I just want to end. I want to end with a bit of bird song, because I want to. It's a very mysterious piece of bird song. I don't even know what it means. It's the thing that was in my head most when I was writing the book. And it's an Appalachian song, so it's probably written by an Irish Scots person 300 years ago. It's only 4.5 seconds, because I won't terrorize you beyond that. And it's a sort of a children's song. I actually don't know what it is, but I'm going to just end, because I love you so much, Alex, and I'm going to sing it for you and pretend no one else is here. So
no one else is here.
So, okay. And it is about freedom, actually. Little birdie, why do you fly so high? It's because I am a pretty little bird, and I do not fear to die.